Welcome, I'm glad you're here. This is Jennifer. So I have a lot to share with you today. This is one of my longer videos or crafty episodes. I first will start out by showing the newest color of Tim Holtz Distress and do a comparison with other colors that are already in the collection. Then I have 4 techniques to share with you of ways to use distress products to quickly color die cuts and make some really fun, bold cards. These techniques are really worth checking out, so I hope you'll stay tuned. But first, let's introduce the newest color of Tim Holtz Distress, and this is Saltwater Taffy. This is right up my alley because, as you probably noticed from my videos, I really like to do peach or coral colored cards a lot. These colors are just very happy and work great with a lot of other colors, such as teals, greens, and more. So here are all the different distress products available in this new Saltwater Taffy. First and foremost, you have the original Distress Ink, which a lot of people have had for many years. And then there is the re-inker for that. Next, we have Distress Oxide ink, which is a little bit different. We'll be using both of these inks in today's video, so I'll be talking about it as we go. And there is a re-inker available for that too. Then we have the rest of the collection, which includes the Distress Spray Stain on the left and the Distress Oxide Spray on the right, and we'll be using these today. And then finally, there is the Distress Paint. Not going to use this today, but hope to in a future video, and this beautiful color of embossing glaze. If you've never used glaze before, I'll link to a video up here on the top right. Now here are color swatches for the 2 distress inks. You have the traditional on the left and the oxide on the right. This is a beautiful soft peach or coral color, just gorgeous. Now remember, distress ink is a type of dye ink and it absorbs in the paper. So if you're going to stamp it onto a colored cardstock, you'll lose its true color. Whereas oxide ink has a little bit of pigment property in it, so it'll sit on top of the cardstock. So you can use it on dark cardstock. So there's a comparison for you there. Oxide inks are wonderful for blending because of that pigment property to it, and you'll see that today. I like that this is a lighter color, which is very helpful when doing blending, especially when you want something softer. Now I know the biggest question will be, how does this new Saltwater Taffy color compare with colors already in the collection? So I have my swatches for colors that are kind of in the same color family. These are the Distress Ink swatches. The nice thing about a peach ink is that it works well with pinks, it works well with reds, and it works well with oranges. You can kind of team it up with any of them. Now my favorite is to use the Saltwater Taffy, the Worn Lipstick, Abandoned Coral, and Festive Berries together. That kind of goes from light to dark. But the Abandoned Coral and Saltwater Taffy, those two will be best friends. So we'll be using some of these other darker colors and other shades throughout this video too. Now here are the ink swatches for the oxide version. So this is the oxide ink. Remember, this has a little bit of a pigment property to it, so it's great for blending. It's great for using on dark cardstocks. And you can see the Saltwater Taffy is a very unique color compared to the others and matches up nicely with many of them. Now with oxide inks, I think the light colors are really a huge advantage because you can blend from light to dark very easily with these. You can overlap the colors and they blend effortlessly, which you'll be seeing in a moment. I really, again, love the look of the Saltwater Taffy with the Abandoned Coral and also with Festive Berries and Worn Lipstick. But you can also pull it to more of like a brick red color with the Fired Brick Red. All right, so now that we've taken a closer look at the different colors here, let's start creating. There's a little story behind why I kind of came up with these ideas for doing quick, bold coloring of die cuts. So back in the fall, I needed to make about 400 cards. Most of them were going to a Hero Arts event to thank people for being a part of it, just something I wanted to do, long story. Anyway, the others were going to some other crafty things. So I really did make 400 cards like this. I have these left over. What I decided to do was do a bunch of die cutting and then quick inking of the die cuts and then just glue them to a card. Now I'm not doing the same design today or using the same dies, but I am using the same technique, the first technique that I'll be sharing. After we share this first technique, I will share 3 others that give different results. So you can pick out which one you think you might want to give a try. Okay, so technique or method number 1 is to create these bold watercolory die cuts with a gold shimmer to them. So I'm using the Honeybee Stamps Lovely Layers Tulip dies. I'm going to be using a few different floral sets from Honeybee today. I think they're really well designed, great for layering, and also perfect for this technique. I'm starting by doing a bunch of die cutting using watercolor paper. Now, there are so many watercolor papers out there. Everybody has their favorite. Some people like the fine arts one. I really like Tim Holtz watercolor paper because it is true white and it works great for a lot of the distress techniques that I like to do. So I am taping all of the dies onto a piece of watercolor paper. It's cut to the size because I had these scraps left over. And then I will run it through my die cut machine. You could use whatever die cut machine you have. Now, the reason I taped them all together is after I take these die cuts out and put them in little trays to keep them organized, I can then keep all of the dies connected and move it on to another piece of cardstock of the same size. So by keeping them connected, I don't have to fiddle with them all the time. This is how I did all of those leaf die cuts for those hundreds of cards that I just showed you. Another thing you can do if you have a magnetic plate is keep your dies stuck to that and just leave the dies there and run your cardstock through over and over. I do find it helpful when making lots of cards to have those little trays that you see up there. I use them on absolutely every card. These are also the trays that I save my extras in for future use. I'll link to the trays that I like below. Okay, so I went through and did a bunch of die cutting from watercolor paper using that Lovely Leaves Tulip set. I'm taking all the flower petal die cuts and I'm laying them down on my work surface. I decided to switch to white so you could see all of the ink that we'll be applying. I think the fastest way to create beautiful die cuts is to use Tim Holtz Distress Stain Spray. It's a tongue twister. This is a spray product that's similar to Distress Ink, so it'll move a lot in the same way. Now this is the Saltwater Taffy color. You can see how beautiful it is. You could keep it this kind of light color, but I wanted bold, so I'm going to add more color to this. But I always like to start with the lightest first. Now you can see this sprays very easily. A little goes a long way. And you'll notice there is overspray happening on my work surface. Don't worry, we're going to use that overspray. Now I'm adding some candied apple color. The really nice thing about distress sprays is you can use two very different colors and they'll blend no matter what, without much effort. The water or the liquid in it does the work for you. Well, the candied apple goes nicely with the Saltwater Taffy, but here I'm coming in with the Villainous Potion, I think it's called. It's the newest, like darker purple from the Distress line. And believe it or not, it looks like I totally messed these all up. It'll dry beautifully. So I sprayed some of that purple on the die cuts just to make it a little bit darker. And then I sprayed it some with Tim Holtz Mica spray. Now the mica spray is just clear with I chose the gold colored mica, and that will just add in some shine to all of these die cuts. A little goes a long way with the mica spray. You don't need much. I do like to spray it while the die cuts are wet because it blends in and gives a shimmery look. You could include your Distress Oxide sprays in this if you want, which will give kind of a creaminess. But today I'm sticking with just Distress Stain Spray and the mica spray, which added the gold. Now I'm taking all these die cuts and putting it onto a piece of scrap cardstock, and I'm going to set it aside to dry. It doesn't matter how messy they look, just set it aside. It'll dry beautifully. Now notice there is a lot of color on my work surface. I'm not going to let that go to waste. It's a beautiful mix of the colors we used, even that gold shimmer. So I took these next die cuts and put them face down into that color and moved them around, pressed it in with my tweezers, and then I pick them up and look at these have gorgeous color now too. So you can use up all that color still on your work surface. I'm working on a glass work surface, which I highly recommend, but you could also use a craft sheet. Here I'm going and picking up some more color with some of the smaller die cuts. Now this doesn't take that long if you're doing a bunch of die cuts at once. When I made those leaf cards, the 400 leaf cards, I had my work surface covered with die cuts so I could get them all colored at once. I would then leave them to dry and then come back later and glue them to my cards. Another thing you can do is use a paintbrush to pick up some of that excess color and just add it to your die cuts as I'm doing here. I didn't want these to be as dark, so that way I could control it a little bit better. But again, it doesn't take much time. I'm not really painting here. I'm just plopping some color on the die cuts. I'm letting the fluid in the Distress Spray stain do the work and movement for me. Now there will still be excess color on my work surface. I'll show you what I do with that on my next example. Once they're dry, if you want to, you can add a few more spritzes of the mica spray. If you want maybe some little drops of gold color on it, you can do a half pump, press all the way for a mist. Totally up to you and how much shine you want. But again, a little goes a long way with the mica sprays. And by the way, mica sprays come in a pack of 3, so you can get 3 different metallic colors. Okay, now I did the same thing with the leaves die cuts. Again, these are cut from watercolor paper. This time I really just wanted them green. I didn't use a real mix of colors. I used the wilderness color mostly. And I just sprayed water on it to get the color to move. And then I picked those up, put it onto my piece of cardstock, and set it aside to dry. Now I had all this leftover color on my work surface. I had that with the red too. And what I do is I just take a big piece of watercolor paper and press it in there and pick up that color and then set that aside to dry. And we can die cut from that later, which you'll see me do. So this is a great way to use up those colors. It will have some shimmer to it too. So when we die cut it, it'll be green and shiny. Okay, so now I have all these die cuts dry and ready to go. And they have this beautiful mix of colors and that gold shine to it. And it took very little effort. So now I can just assemble them. And notice that since each die cut is a little different, thanks to the different colors of Distress Spray stain I used, when you layer them, you get this fun variation between the petals, which just really makes the layers stand out more. Now I'm using my liquid adhesive to glue these die cuts together on the bottom. I'm not gluing the petals up towards the top of the layered die cut together because I'm going to go add some dimension in there. I'm just using little foam squares and tucking those behind the tops of the petals, which will make them stand out more and show those layers. Now these are layered die cuts. I didn't make 400 with layered die cuts, but I plan to make about 20 like this at the end of the weekend, hopefully. Here you can see the smaller tulip layered together, and you can see how some of the die cuts are lighter than others, so you get this beautiful layered look when you're done. After I assembled my tulips and stems, it's time to create some cards. I'm going to show you 2 different designs with these, and then we'll move on to the next technique. For the background on my first one, I used 2 background dies. We have the Swirling Leaves pierced cover plate on the left, and the Secret Garden cover plate on the right. I'm trying to do more of layering of different things to build up that texture and just add interest to my background, and that's what I'm doing here. So I have a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding note card that I created from Gina K Whisper cardstock, which is a soft gray. And I'm using that cover plate piercing die to create that pierce pattern on the front of the card. Thankfully, this die doesn't cut the outside edge, so I'm able to do it on the front of the note card. I then used the other die to create this little Secret Garden frame that I cut from white cardstock, and I'm adding that to the front of the card. So now we have the piercing and the white die cut on top. Lots of fun texture. Now I can add my tulips that I colored using Distress Spray Stain and Distress Mica Spray. I'm telling you that method is super fast if you plan to do a bunch of colored die cuts. I haven't found anything faster. It also works if you're only doing a few. You just put it right on your work surface or in a spray box and go to town. Now I wanted that yellow spray die cut that I created in the middle, that I created with Distress Spray Stain. I wanted that to be a little bit darker towards the base. So I'm using my Tim Holtz Distress Ink in Gathered Twigs and a small blending brush just to add some brown ink to it. So if you find you want parts of your die cuts to be a little bit darker, you can add Distress Ink to it. And then for a sentiment, I use the Honeybee Get Well Soon stamp set and coordinating dies. I love this set. I use it a few times in this video. I just stamp the sentiment with black on white cardstock and use the die to cut it out. There are dies available to cut out all these sentiments, which I love. It cuts it out nice and close, makes it super easy to add to your card. The last step is to add 3 little gold colored pearls to the center of that flower, just for a little pop of shine. These are self-adhering little pearls and gems from Honeybee. They have tons of colored packs. They're just beautiful. So all you have to do is pick it up and put it right onto your project and it'll stay put. Now, I thought it'd be fun to use a matching envelope. Now, Honeybee has these pre-printed A2 envelopes that are amazing. They have a few different packs. The inside of the envelope actually has a different pattern too. So I'll use a few of these today. This is the one I chose for this card. I love a matching envelope. Whether it's solid or patterned like this, I think it really makes your card stand out. So this is the completed card. You can see the shine on those die cuts. I love the look of this. I love that it's not perfectly watercolored. I love that there are a variety of colors there together. Just a fun and fast way to create some bold die cuts. I did make a second card using some of these die cuts. I used the Honeybee Quilted Coverplate die to do this. This cuts a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch piece with that faux stitching. You can see it over there on the right. So I ran that through my die cut machine, and this is what I get. But I wanted to show you how to really make it stand out more. I'm demonstrating on my Platinum 6. I have my platform, and then that tan embossing mat, which allows you to make an impression with the die. So I put my die cut and the die together, put the embossing plate on top, and run it through. So with this step, we're pressing that die into the cardstock thanks to that gray or that tan embossing mat. And look at how it creates this like pillowed effect. So if you have any type of piercing or faux stitching die cuts, try doing the impression with it too. Now for a sentiment, I use the Memory Box Miss You Posh Script die set. So here is the completed card. Now in the quilting pattern, I added some pearls. I just thought that would be a fun way to make the background stand out even more. You can see our layered die cuts with all the distress goodness, and the Miss You, which I cut from white cardstock and from gold. And the best part about this first technique is I have lots of die cuts left over. Here are some of them. I'll put them in a little container and then I'll use them later on, or you can set them in a drawer for whenever you need some quick embellishments. Now it's time for my second suggestion for creating fast distressed colored die cuts. This time I'm using sprays again, but I'm starting out with the whole sheet of watercolor paper. This is the Tim Holtz watercolor paper. I'm using Distress Stain Spray in the Saltwater Taffy and putting that down first. This time I decided to also add some Distress Oxide Spray. You can see this goes down a little creamier, but the color is the same. So you could use these together or separately, totally up to you. Now you can also add water to this. So spray it with water to get the color moving a bit more if you don't want to see those splotches. I will tell you, this will look like a hot mess at first, but just bear with me. I promise we'll get there. This doesn't take long at all and you'll get great results. Okay, so now that I have like this base layer of this saltwater taffy color, I will spray darker colors on one side. I'm going to create a whole sheet of beautiful inked color, and then we'll die cut from it. So here I'm coming in with some candied apple, spraying that onto the side, and then we'll bring in that purple once again and spray that only along the edge. So we'll have a lot of variety here, and we can choose where we die cut from. I am once in a while just adding a little bit of the mica spray, that gold shimmer, which really makes this shine. I love the shimmer, but you can skip it if you want to. So with this technique, you can use either the oxides, the stain sprays, or a mix of the two as I did. All right, now you can heat this, which kind of causes the colors to move and create these really cool effects, or you can just let it dry. Totally up to you. Now this is a huge sheet of beautiful colored paper with that shine to it, and we can die cut from this however we want. And we'll have lots of scraps left over that we can save for the next time we need some pretty colored die cuts. Now remember that sheet of watercolor paper where I picked up all that excess green ink on my work surface from the last technique? Well, here it is dry. I wanted to have some of it be a little bit darker, so I'm spraying a darker green oxide spray and some water on it, and then I'll let that dry. So then we'll have a nice variation of greens that we can also die cut once it's dry. So after I give these a little bit of time to dry, look at this beautiful peach piece we have. I love this. You could cut this down and use it as backgrounds, but I'm going to die cut from it. This time I'm using another Honeybee layered flower die set. I love flowers, but you could definitely die cut whatever shapes you want to out of these. So I cut different sections from that background. You can see some I cut from a light section, some I cut from a darker, and some from the middle. And that'll give me different colored die cuts to layer together, creating a beautiful contrast. So here are the different pieces, all cut from that same watercolor paper. I'll glue these together, just adding glue to the center portion only, so I can tuck some foam squares underneath the petals to make them stand out more. If you find you want a little more shading or a little more color in a certain area, just use your Distress ink. That's great for adding a little depth to it. It really is quick. Don't do too much. You really want to stick with what the sprays did for you. It's a big time saver. Okay, I also have my green sheet. This is what it looks like when it's dry, and I can cut different areas out of this. Now this one, I really just wanted two different shades of green. So you can see how I have the darker on one side and the lighter on the other. I love those splotches that we ended up with. I feel like that adds a lot of character to our die cuts. So I cut some green leaf die cuts from the same set, and I needed some brown for the center of the flower. So I just took one of my scraps from the peach, added some gathered twigs Distress ink on top, and then I'll cut from that. So just go ahead and add other colors with a blending tool and Distress ink to the top if you want to change it up a little bit. This gives similar results to the first technique, but a little bit cleaner because you can cut out the areas that you want. Okay, now for the background on this card, I wanted to add a little interest, so I used the new Honeybee Lovely Layers Greenery die set. I cut one of the leaves several times from white cardstock, and I'm gluing it onto a white note card just to add a little texture to the background. This is a mini slimline note card that is 3.5 by 6.25 inches. I originally thought I'd do a mini slimline card because I love this size, but I ended up changing my mind in a moment, and you'll see that. But here I'm just gluing those white die cuts down to cover the entire front. Then I flip it over when it's dry and cut off the excess. Next, I added all of those flower and leaf die cuts that we created, and here is my final card. I ended up making a bigger card because I allowed the leaves and die cuts to hang off the left side there. So instead of using a mini slimline envelope, I'm using a 5 by 7 envelope, and it'll fit in there perfect. I love the look of the die cuts hanging off the side. I did add a take care of yourself sentiment using that get well soon stamp set and die set that I used in my last examples. I did add some brown pearls from Honeybee to the center, and look at that layering and the shine and the color. I still have lots of leftover inked paper that I can use to create more cards. So I have those saved, and I'll be creating with them this weekend. And by the way, this coral envelope is a 5 by 7 envelope from Cards and Pockets. I'll link to my favorite sources below. I did stamp a sentiment on the envelope, and that is from this Honeybee Sealed with Love stamp set. This has lots of great sentiments to put on the back of your cards or on your envelopes. There are also coordinating dies available, and even some hot foil plates that coordinate. So you'll see me use this stamp set a few times on my envelopes throughout this video. I will say, of all the techniques I do today, this I think gives my favorite results. It's a very clean look, beautiful color, and lots of shimmer. And I have tons of that colored cardstock left over to make more. Okay, now it's time for our third technique. This one is one of my tried and true that I've done many times over the years. I will link to another video up here on the top right where I show it. This is very fast, great if you're making one card or 40, and it really is a great way to use your Distress ink to create beautiful results. My first two techniques were with sprays. Now we're working with the ink pads. This is Distress ink, the original Distress ink that many of us have. Now this time I'm using a different Honeybee Lovely Layered Flower set. This is the Sunflowers. It came out a while ago, but man, I tell you, it gives beautiful results and is perfect for today's technique. Because I'll be using water, I'm using watercolor paper. So this is Tim Holtz watercolor paper. Once again, I die cut it, so I have all my die cuts ready. Now I'm applying Distress ink, the original, onto these die cuts, just putting as much of the Saltwater Taffy down as I can. I recommend going direct to paper. Pick up that ink pad and just press it firmly onto your die cut, kind of twist it around, and get as much ink down as you can. If you want to, and you're more comfortable, you can use a blending tool, but you really want to get a lot of ink down on that. Now this I just did saltwater taffy. I wanted a little bit darker towards the center, so I'm quickly adding some barn door here just towards the center only. It doesn't need to be blended. Do not take a lot of time to blend here. It would just be a waste, I promise. We're going to let the water do the work for us. Now these next layer die cuts, I wanted them to be a little bit darker. So this is the festive berries, and I'm just pressing that directly onto my die cuts. You can see mine needs to be re-inked, so it's not really grabbing onto the cardstock. So I'll just use my blending brush to add more ink to it. I do need to re-ink that guy though. So this one, I just put one color down. But to make this technique even more effective, it's best to put more than one color down. So I'm coming in with seedless preserves and just putting some towards the center. You could go direct to paper, but it's easier in these small areas to just add some with the blending brush, not taking any effort to blend. Now for the bottom layer of the flower, I want this to be the darkest. I'll go direct to paper with barn door or festive berries here, candied apple, any of them would work. And then I'm going direct to paper with that purple, the seedless preserves. And this just is going to put some of that color down. Doesn't matter that it looks terrible, I promise. This is one of those that the hotter the mess at the beginning, the more beautiful the mess at the end. So stick with me. So now I'm going to lay all of these die cuts out. By the way, I'm working on a stencil mat from Waffle flour. This is another great surface to do these techniques on, or glass. Now I'm taking my Tim Holtz sprayer, which is just water, and spraying that generously on these die cuts. The more water you put down, the more fun it will have and the more work it will do for you. It'll still look like a hot mess, don't worry. And now, if you want to, you can add some Distress Mica spray, as I'm doing here, which will give us that shimmer. Then you take this and you set it aside and let it dry. Don't touch it, don't heat set it, don't do anything, just set it aside. It's the hardest thing you'll do all day long, but I promise it's worth it. Now for the leaves, I'm just pressing Twisted Citron Distress Ink onto it. Then I'm coming in with the Rustic Wilderness and adding a little bit of that to it too. Don't spend much time on this. See how fast it is? It'll work out in the end, I promise. You can do this technique with Oxide inks also. However, if you use Oxide inks, you'll get a creamier result, but that's okay. And it often turns out lighter if you use Oxide inks. But if that's the look you're going for, you can definitely use that. But for this particular technique, I prefer to use Distress Ink, the original. So there you can see I pressed Wild Honey on the top piece, gathered twigs to the middle, Rusty Hinge to the bottom, spray these all generously with water, a little mica spray, set it aside. Super fast, and it'll do the work for you. Now here, after they're dry, we have all these beautiful die cuts, beautiful colors. I like the randomness of it. I think when I do my own ink blending of die cuts, I spend too much time trying to get it just right. This allows you to kind of break free of that and go with whatever results you get, and they always work out great. So I'm just layering these flowers and putting them together, and look at that. I love the variation of colors. By the way, I wanted to mention, if you don't have mica spray, you can also put Perfect Pearl pigment powder into water and spray with that, and that will add some shimmer. It's a little bit different, but it definitely adds that shine. This time I decided to take 3 flowers and smush them together on one card. This is a 5x7 white note card, and I'm gluing my 3 flowers onto it, kind of forming a triangle, and then I will tuck my leaves under it. I wanted more leaves than the ones I created. So remember, I had a bunch of leaves left over from my first technique, so I decided to add those to this too. Creating and saving extras is something that is a huge time saver for me. Now for a sentiment this time, I wanted it very bold, so I used the Honeybee Thanks die set. There is a stamp set that coordinates. You can use these together or separately, and they're sold together or separately. Now the die set actually has 3 dies. The one that cuts thanks, a shadow for it, then a second shadow that has faux pierced dots on the inside edge. I only used the word itself and the one shadow, cutting from gold cardstock and white, and I added that right on top of our flowers. I also added some of the Honeybee gold pearls to the center of the flowers too. Take a look at the different colors and the shine that we have on those flowers. It took very little time to make all of these. I could have put each flower on a different card and had 3, but sometimes you just want to go all out on one card to make it extra special. If you have distress inks and a water spray bottle, you gotta try this technique. I do recommend using watercolor paper. It really is helpful when you're adding that much water, and the results are always gorgeous. Okay, now my last technique for coloring die cuts quickly with distress products is good old ink blending. But we're going to do it in a very quick way that takes very little time. So if you want to make multiples, you can. This is the only technique today where I'm not using water, so I'm not going to use watercolor paper. Instead, I just use white cardstock. Use whatever you've got, the smoother the better. I die cut some of the lovely layers tulips that I used in my first examples from white cardstock, and I'm covering them first with Saltwater Taffy Oxide ink. I am a firm believer that if you want to do blending, Oxide inks are definitely the easiest to blend with. Oxide inks have dye properties and pigment properties. Those pigment properties allow them to sit more on the cardstock, making them easier to blend. It's so much more forgiving than a regular dye ink. When I want to do blending of die cuts like this, I start with my lightest color first and I cover the die cut. In this case, I use the Saltwater Taffy. Then I apply my darkest color to the area that I want it. In this case, I did purple. Then I take a color kind of in between and I blend the two. You don't have to work hard at this at all, especially when you're using die cuts. They're small, we're going to layer them. You won't see if it's not perfectly blended. But I'm telling you, with Oxide inks, it really is easy, especially if you put that base coat down. Everything you add on top will really blend nicely. I do use my Tim Holtz ink blending tool for this with the rounded foam on it. I really think that's the best tool for Oxide inks. So here I'm just going back and adding a little more of picked raspberry between the purple and the peach. So you can blend any colors together using Oxide inks because they are very forgiving and easy to blend. For the leaves, I again used white cardstock, and I'm starting with the lighter color, which is Twisted Citron, using the Oxide ink. If you want to save time, you could go direct to paper with the ink pad to put down that first layer. Now I'm coming in with a much darker Rustic Wilderness in the Oxide and adding that to the edge of the leaves. Notice how fast I'm doing this. It doesn't take much effort, and you can easily blend between the light and the dark colors. The results of this will be very smooth and very creamy looking, a much different look than we've been doing all along. Now, if you want to add more color to this, to make it darker in some areas, you can come on top of it with your traditional distress ink, which is a dye ink and it'll go down a little bit darker. There I added a little bit more red to the base. So don't be afraid to mix, but I do think it's best to put down your Oxide first, and then you can add more bold color on top with the traditional inks if you want to, but you could definitely skip this step if you want. Okay, so now let's assemble some flowers. I did some that were purple and peach, and then I did some that were just completely peach. I'm again just gluing along the bottom of the die cuts, and then adding foam tape behind the petals to make them stand up. After I assembled my flowers, let's create a couple cards. This first one, I did that quilted background that I used earlier, same one, and I added my tulips to it. I then chose a few little pearls here to add to the background, just like I did before. I wanted to show you how many different options there are from Honeybee. I mean, every color you can imagine is in these packs. So I chose a few to go to the center of the tulips, and then some to go along the background, along that quilted pattern. For sentiment, I used the new Honeybee Bitty Buzzwords Bloom stamp set and coordinating die set. These can be used together or separately. That coordinating die set has the words and the shadow dies, and you can use the shadow dies to match up with the stamped words. I love that there are many options. I'll be using the UR from the stamp set along with the kind layered die cuts. There are many different Bitty Buzzword theme sets from Honeybee if you're looking for great sentiments. So here is this card. You can see the quilted background like we did earlier in this video, and I added pearls to that pattern. We have our Oxide flower, which is very creamy and soft looking, but I did really quick blending on those. Then we have our sentiment. I gold heat embossed UR on a sentiment strip. And then I created the word kind using gold cardstock and white. And then I chose a matching Honeybee envelope. Okay, I have one last card using the other Oxide flowers. These die cuts here I created with the Honeybee Garden Lattice background dies. There are 2 dies that you can use together or separate. And these I actually found in my extras drawer. I had them left over from something else, and I look at that drawer all the time to find my extras or leftovers. And I thought this would be a fun texture to add to our card. Both are cut from white cardstock. I glued them together, and I'm adding them to a white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. So all this is doing is adding a little texture to this simple card design. If you don't have room for like a drawer for your extras or leftovers, I recommend getting a binder and having page protectors in it. You can slide all the extras in it and then flip through and find what you need next time you create. For the sentiment on this, I used the Honeybee Squeeze the Day stamp set. Again, it's got those coordinating dies, which make it really easy to stamp and die cut and add anywhere on your layered card. I did add a few little gemstones to the center of the flower, but that's it. I kept it very simple so that the focus is on that beautiful, fast blending we got with the Distress Oxide inks. You can definitely do the blending with the traditional Distress ink, but I feel like the Oxide gives much better results and a lot faster. The Tim Holtz Distress collection is a brilliant line because of all the different things it has to offer. I'm hoping that by showing you these different methods with different products from the collection, that you can think about what you might want to try and what might work best for you and the products you have. If you're interested in all of these things, they're linked below in my YouTube description. I also have a free ink swatch download for the Distress inks, and that's over my blog too, which I will link below also. Then at the end here, I will link to a couple other related videos. Thank you for spending this time with me. I know it's a longer video, but I hope it was worth it. Take care and we'll see you soon.